morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be present and to share my thoughts on what I think are our challenges to support fintech in Thailand. I have a one-page slide that sums up the challenges. The first challenge is on the legal foundation for digitization, and it still, the problem still remains. Although we trade stocks in a scriptless manner, the law requires actual script, but you can put it in a depository and then have the representation. So it's called the immobilization type as opposed to the dematerialized type. And that wouldn't be so much of a problem if there's not a monopoly on the depository. The law talks about some legal foundation, our securities law, written in 1992, gives a legal basis for immobilization for scriptless trading, but only when the depository is provided by the Stock Exchange of Thailand or its subsidiary. And that means that no one else can effectively be a depository. Lately, 2 years ago, a year or two ago, in our FinTech Challenge program, one contestant proposed to, it's Kun Top from Private Chain, proposed to do an exchange that used blockchain technology and settle real time, and he wants to take on the stock exchange. But of course, there's that legal monopoly that we had to find a way to fix for him. And while working on that, my question was, could we have digital shares? And we had to go back to the Ministry of Commerce and the EDDA, I don't know what it's called, it stands for, it's the Electronic Transaction Development Agency or something like that, yeah. And they say that their law accommodates using different technologies to replace actual paper, but we need to have some finer rules from the Ministry of Commerce. And of course, nobody is going to do that. So in the end, we try to solve it by drafting this so-called FinTech Act or FinTech Bill, which we completed several months ago. That one section of that would try to provide a legal foundation for digital issuance and things like that. That bill has now been put back to the Ministry of Finance, and I don't know what's with it. So that's another problem with us, getting things fixed in a timely manner. There's the Foundation for Digital ID, and I think there is this whole working group supported by the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of DE. And there's some test case going on with the banks and brokers, so I'm hoping to see something coming out that year for that. There's still a little problem that in our law there's no basis for, no requirement for data portability. So brokers and banks may still feel that clients' information is their property, and although they are careful not to, they might be careful not to give it to others, fearing that they would be violating personal data right, but they also refuse to, I think they might also refuse to send that information to another provider, even upon the request of the client itself. So I think we still have a long way to go for that mentality. We try to propose something like that for in our securities rules, but the brokers objected. we have some challenges removing barriers for new players. And as I mentioned, that having a legal monopoly on something is something really hard to go around. And the case in point that I would like to bring as an example is that electronic trading platform. Because our law talks about the exchange being a legal monopoly. We looked at other jurisdictions and we find that they don't need to call the electronic trading platforms exchanges. They are called like ATSs in the US. So we tried to look for that route. And we found that in most jurisdictions, those are like brokers. Because I think they start from brokers. The problem is our brokerage license regime is also not helpful because it's still too rigid and expensive. Brokers have to pay upfront fee to the SEC of 20 million baht. We try to change that. We try to remove that upfront fee. The ministry objects, saying that it would affect previous players who have paid, even though we think we have a way of trying to compensate. So they refused to allow us to change that regime. So instead, we had to go around to a different route and define electronic trading platform as a different type of securities business. So it doesn't need to be a broker and pay us 20 million baht. But when I define a different type of securities business, again, we need to wait for a year to a year and a half before the rule would take effect because it needs to go through all the channels, and that's really frustrating. So when we defined that business, we add in a little clause that says you don't need a license if you are under the SEC sandbox, and we were able to pull that off for some reason. So now that's the only channel that people who wants to provide an electronic trading platform service in Thailand can come. They can be under our sandbox. I'm not proud to say that we've used the sandbox as a way to solve our problem with licensing. So it's not a sandbox in the way that what most people would think, which should be an experiment by the providers or by the regulators. We have some problem with the cross-border challenges. Defining the boundaries of jurisdiction, I think that's quite common around the world. Cross-border enforcement effectiveness, but then the most important of all, I think for us, is the mindset of the policymakers. I'm not sure if our policymakers are truly ready for cross-border activities. Just to take an example of this ICO, we already get a directive from the Ministry of Finance that for now, they think that issuers should not be foreign companies. Okay, it should be companies set up in Thailand. And so what the most we could try to do is to make sure that that doesn't go in the law that they're drafting. And we offer to put it in our rule instead. So don't be surprised that we come up with some rule like that, because it's better for these things to be in our rule than to be in the law, because our rule is easier to fix. There's a challenge of dealing with finding an effective supervision regime for this so-called platform economy. And the traditional ways of doing things is that we count on our activities being done through centralized providers like the exchange or a group of brokers that aggregate around this centralized broker exchange. So our traditional thinking is that we use permission for everything, permission for all kinds of players, prescription for all kinds of conduct, and even restriction for investors if we think that it's good for them to be restricted. And so that, to me, is like saying that we are, or the government would be the central authority of what they think is good and right and good for the market. And it doesn't really encourage market discipline. It's an obstacle to market-based solution that could happen. For example, with mutual funds, we need people who to provide independent advice for investors other than the banks who are selling the products. And it's really hard for us to get to find a way to get the, make room for these independent advisors because of the thinking around everything being tied with banks in the past. So that's finally the idea of restricting investors from buying something. The ministry also says they don't want retail investors to buy ICO. We offer, of course, to put a limit, a ceiling, which people are not happy about, but it's better than not allowing anything. And this kind of restriction is also not appreciated by investors. So the SEC's idea of a desired regime would be one that could have more room for competition, more information flow, more tools to help interpret and compare, more ease of switching, which can now be afforded by technology, so that people would have true choice and that would lead to true market discipline. But that kind of thinking, I mean, that's like wishful thinking, and we are struggling to carry our organization or the rest of the authorities to move, to switch their mindset to that. And that's a really big challenge. And I might save the thing about ICO and tax for later. Because Bryn mentioned this cryptocurrency tax, I might have a piece to say here, even though I have to disclaim that I'm not part of the Revenue Authority, and in fact I have no position from the SEC saying this. But, so this is a personal view, and based on what I see in the newspaper, they talk about taxing income that's paid out of ICO at 15%, and capital gains tax of 15% or something, and I wasn't thinking much of it. I mean, we can talk about whether this is competitive and so on. But I was more appalled by other rumors that I've been hearing that when you talk about fairness, the Revenue Authority has this authority to assess income tax, or assess what they think is the proper level of revenue for a company. So if you sell something at 100, but you claim that you sell at 50, then they have the right to say, no, it's not 50, it's 100, right? What I'm hoping would not happen is that they might use that kind of authority to tax people on the issuance of ICO. And I think that would kill everything. I mean, that's worse than taxing income from ICO or taxing profits upon trade of this, because if that really happens, and I'm crossing my fingers, I'm hoping that it would not happen. It's not in the law that they're proposing. It's an existing law that allows them to tax companies. And so it would be good if people talk about it a lot in the public, so that about the idea of fair taxation and why it would be detrimental to the country if you start, if you don't try to make it clear that fundraising isn't taxed. It's not just a matter of people going to do ICO elsewhere, but it's now a matter of people not wanting to set up a company in Thailand at all. As this is like if you are subject to an unfair tax on something that shouldn't be taxed, that's a different problem, a worse problem than the problem of taxing something that could be taxed with an uncompetitive rate. And I can't go much more than here, but because it might be hearsay that I'm hearing, but I think it would be useful if people try to give the government some wake-up call. It's an interpretation of an existing rule that they don't need to fix, but you need them to fix. So it's like, they're not even offering a new rule, but the fact that they're not giving a new rule that gives you this clarity is going to be a problem for you. So you need to press them on that. With the exception of crypto, I would say that our approach, we try to take the active approach of supporting general and fintech, and maybe a little bit more on fintech. The difficulty is in the implementation. The goal is clear. We want to take that active approach. I think the obstacle there is not so much mentality, but because we are restricted by our tools, because we still have to operate under the existing law and rules, and it's really hard to change our laws. It's not so hard to change our rule, but it's hard to change our law. And so it's like you have all these square boxes, and then suddenly you need to find ways to fit things that don't fit in that square boxes, in those boxes, and you have no other choice but to fit them. And the example I mentioned about going around that legal monopoly of the exchange, for example.
And I understand why they want to do anything but changing the law, because I've spent the longest I've spent was coming up with this
Futures Act, derivatives law. It took us like 9 years, like maybe 2 years drafting, because it was new to us, and things were changing. And the time we were drafting, there was this Barings case, so we had to be really careful. But then after that, it's like 6 or 7 years passing the law in the normal time, and then that's why people resort to other forms of law. And so when there is this government, this military government, everybody wants it as the easier, faster way of fixing the law, or using this special power, Section 44. But that's not really good. And then sometimes when you come out with the law too fast, and it could be also used, like for example, this ICO law. The SEC is ready to come out with an SEC regulation on ICO offering, and we conducted a hearing for a couple of months. And then, the policy now is that it has to go together with other crypto assets and be under the same special law. And they're going to make it quick because they use a different type called like the decree or something, I don't know. But then that requires no public hearing. So it's almost like, I can understand the frustration or the fear of going to change the law, because on one hand, you can't get anything. And then on the other hand, you have a way of passing something really quickly, but you could go wrong because you don't talk to people. And it's like, I don't know, which is the worst evil. I think we have a problem of sharing anonymized data, because the law, the previous drafts that I've seen, still requires consent. But if it's anonymized, who's going to get consent from, right? And we try to address that in the Fintech Act. There's a section that we talked about. We talk about open anonymized data from the government first. That the Act would require that where fintech providers want to obtain data that it is in possession of the government, and if it's not, if there's no prohibition specifically for sharing that data, then they should be able to request anonymized data from that government. And we then add a clause that even if it's voluntary sharing, by anyone. If they want to share anonymized data, then that can be done. But it has to be anonymized in the way of the standards that's determined by some committee under that law. So I'm hoping that maybe that will
And I hope that would also look out to a change to the credit information definition of what a financial institution would be. So we look forward to the Fintech Act because we are eagerly waiting. So once it's up and how it's being implemented.
But my observation is that, at least when I observe with the securities regulators, that we don't think a lot about, we've not thought of enough about the design of the landscape of how it would affect competition. Because even in the securities market where we push for liberalization more than other regulators and more than other sectors of the financial industry, even after we liberalized licenses, it took us a number of years dealing with the reactions of incumbents. I mean, we've gone through the time when some newcomer would come in and offer services at smaller prices and cheaper prices, and there were like wide rejections from the incumbents, right? And so from that observation, from our angle, I mean, it might not be too much to say that we care a great deal about incumbents. And so carrying that to say the bank regulator, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if whatever facility or systems that are created, you need buy-in from the incumbents, the big incumbents. And so then, the rules and the architecture might tend to favor the existing incumbents and not the smaller players, and unintentional or intentional, that's the way it is. So we have to admit that the regulators probably do not spend enough time thinking about competition, or does not make competition a goal or an objective for regulators. In fact, when you start talking about it, you might appear odd, but I think it's going to change over time.